Hello, Houston. I just wanted to give you a kind of an update on what we had been talking about last time, a kind of a gentle reminder. This is as far as we got preceding in our last lecture, talking about systematic desensitization and then implosion therapy as the two most, implosive therapy as the two most recent examples. There are some other therapies that fall in that general realm that we could mention. We won't because we don't have the time, but in essence, things like use of modeling is a relatively newer process over the last decade or so. It's increasing in use, and it's showing a lot of particular tendency to be used in things like training and various kinds of extinction activities that are significantly trying to alter behavior by removing them, essentially. Aversive therapy is a specific applied form of that that's good for the treatment of things like, for instance, addictions to food, sexual deviations, and so forth. Most social learning and behavioral therapies that we've discussed so far really have involved predominantly an avoidance response and or punishment of some sort. Today, what we're going to do is move into looking at various forms of operant therapies, positive reinforcement-based therapies, in which we have to have the ability to essentially achieve complete or almost complete control of the patient's environment in terms of the consistent. What we're going to try and do is consistently reward correct responses and prevent any reinforcement of inappropriate or incorrect for non-performance, essentially, for incorrect responses in that situation. So essentially what we do here is to assume that abnormal behavior is learned behavior. And learned behavior responds in accord with the principles of learning. That's kind of the underlying premise. And what we're going to do is control abnormal behavior through applying the principles of learning. And so in this case, the procedure will involve essentially specifying the target response, what it is that we're trying to alter, knowing the relevant reinforcers, what it is in the environment of that individual that is in fact reinforcing the behavior that he or she may not want and that their friends and family definitely may not want. And essentially then what we're going to do is develop a program to apply a reinforcer whenever the target response, the desired behavior, actually occurs. A lot of different ways in which that can be done. One of them involves what is called a token economy, which essentially needs a primary reinforcer of one sort or another, but with a little added effort, a little added work, what you can do is establish a secondary reinforcer. This goes all the way back. The sources on this originally were investigators, psychologists by the name of Ullman and Krasner, with publications that started way back in 1969. And the procedure in this case basically involves, first of all, designate a behavior as good and then essentially reinforceable, and establish a token of some sort, essentially a secondary reinforcer that can be a chip or it can be points. Classroom teachers will use it sometimes, and then have a backup, a primary reinforcer that can be used, things like free time, food objects, and that kind of thing. So often a teacher using a token economy will have a list right on his or her classroom that plainly labels, you know, seven reinforcers needed for extra time and play period, or a variety of ways in which that can be set up. But normally the tie between the token that you're using, which is a secondary reinforcer, and the actual reinforcers to which it's anchored are right visible and no attempt to hide them at all. The problem that you have with this kind of a token economy is essentially weaning the client back to normal secondary reinforcers, because as you and I know, the world is not handing us token reinforcers just because we do the right thing at a particular time. Tokens are simply not used in the real world. These come with this kind of a procedure comes with some other things that can also be involved or folded into the procedure. One of the more savage ones is timeout. And that is essentially that if a client emits undesirable behavior or refuses to cooperate with the token economy, they can essentially be removed from the situation and thereby eliminate the ability of that individual to earn reinforcers. In a classroom, it can be kind of savage because in some cases, if a kid is simply not cooperating with the teacher and the token economy, he or she may be sitting on a stool in the back of the classroom because ultimately you don't want to remove the youngster from the educational environment. But if they're simply not cooperating with the token economy system, at least you can prevent them from hindering other kids' ability to earn the reinforcers. So timeout is one effective way to do that. Another one in this general area is what's called contingency contracting. That's essentially what you do with your youngster when you say to him or her, if you do thus and so, household responsibilities, I will give you an allowance. In the most generic form, that is essentially, if you do A, I will give you B. And it's frequently used in therapy. It can be used in education, and even in industry, certainly in family relations. And the procedure in that case is essentially to specify the B part, that is what the reinforcers will be in detail, and then monitor the person's behavior in the A part, that is the if you do thus and so. You do have to have sanctions, a punisher, a timeout, if A is not met, is not being responded to appropriately. And we have bonuses for overachievement in the A part. And then you apply the system, if it's in a worker relationship, make sure that it's done equitably and consistently so that they know that the rules that are being used are being consistently and fairly applied in that situation. There are elements of these are the fundamental elements of positive behavioral using, I should say, positively reinforced behavior in a therapeutic situation. If we critique it, it isn't necessarily negative comments that I'm making here, but the treatment approach is typically quite precise. Somebody spells out specifically the behaviors that are desired, and then the rewards that can be gained from that are also precisely spelled out. It's therefore economic of one's time, of the cost to implement it, and of the use of the various people who are involved in that kind of a situation. It depends, of course, on the principles of learning, as I've said a couple of times here already. The training of therapists or the people who are applying the reinforcement regime is easier, and it is, of course, very possible to do research in this kind of situation to demonstrate whether it in fact has the intended positive effects. The success rates really range quite widely depending on the specific condition that is being programmed or manipulated, the skill of the participants in administering reinforcers properly, and so forth. But overall, across all of these different therapies we've looked at, one really fair question to involve or to evolve in this situation is the general one, and that is, does it work? How effective is therapy? Regardless of how we're defining it. And we have a number of different problems with evaluation of therapy, as indicated on the left side of the screen here. One of them has to do with essentially the problem of vague criteria, exactly what it is we're trying to alter, and therefore how are we going to be able to measure whether that alteration has taken place. What do we use in that evaluation? Do we use the therapist's impression of change? Do we use personality test scores? Do we use the patient's interview behaviors in a given situation? Do we talk about reports by friends or relatives? Are they the ones who are to be challenged with this kind of a thing? Do we use the patient's own self-reports of what they think is going on, or their attitude? And or selected kind of overt patient behaviors that we're going to tally in a given situation. The question really is which should be used, and you answer it to a certain extent by what you're trying to achieve. That will to a certain extent limit the ways in which you can measure and acknowledge that success has been achieved in this kind of a situation. A second problem that we have, as noted on the screen, is the problem of biased observers, because everybody's got a vested interest in this system. The patient in this kind of a situation clearly wants to improve, else they wouldn't be a patient. The family who's paying the bills may in some ways have the most interest in trying to achieve some particular kind of effect. They may be the most objective people about are they getting their money's worth out of the effort in that situation. The therapist, on the other hand, may just simply get used to the symptoms and come to, non-critically evaluate what's going on. I'm not saying this goes on, but these are the kind of problems that may introduce biases in the various kind of observers that you'd want to use. There is potentially the lack of adequate control or a comparison group of some sort. Against whom are we going to compare it? An ideal form of behavior? Everybody thinks they practice psychology in these kinds of situations, but would the patient have improved without any specific form of therapy? That is a question. That's really the line against which you judge improvement, however you want to define it. And that is that it may depend on the severity of the patient's problem, the therapist, and the therapy that are being used in a particular situation. Underlying all this is certain kinds of clashes in theoretical orientation that may also occur and be viewed as a problem. Different theories quite obviously have different underlying assumptions. Some are worried about unconscious processes, others strictly keep the arena in the constantly observable, the ever observable kinds of behaviors. So there are different procedures that may be used or advocated, and there can even be different key behaviors in this situation. And the result is that there can be a significant disagreement on how to measure and diagnose client progress in this kind of a therapeutic situation. The safest measure ultimately seems to be as to whether the changes in behavior, in selected behavior, do occur. And the broader question that we face is whether the changes achieved in therapy will actually generalize back out into the real life. It comes back to the fundamental observation I made a little bit earlier, and that is that life doesn't offer us tokens in so many words. We're not given an M&M every time we smile at somebody. And so generalizing from the lab or the therapy office back into the real world can be a problem in some situations. So we've got a lot of different requisites for effective requirement as summarized by the green column on the table there. It includes needing to have a specifiable criterion of some sort. We have to have some way to independently assess whether progress is achieved in a given situation. There has to be an adequate control against what are you trying to alter behavior in a given way compared to what. There have to be measures of long-term effects in the situation, and then ultimately you have to arrive at some kind of evidence of generalization. Does the altered change, even if it works in the office, generalize out to life itself? The best approach for therapy may be to use what is called an eclectic approach. We've got a wide array of possibilities that can be utilized, adapt different strategies in different situations as a function of which seems to be best in a given situation. If you look, for instance, then taking these concerns and look at the future, currently we have, speaking now strictly in terms of therapy, psychotherapy, we have many large institutions, formerly called state mental hospitals. It's an old tradition: build big, have a high wall, isolate from the city, and control the patients, essentially put them in jail, in so many words. Back in the early 1960s, the U.S. government and various professional groups came to realize that these kind of facilities, yes, they include comprehensive therapy programs as they're implemented. They involve occupational therapy, team approach, but they can be very expensive and they're often understaffed. And the result is that what they end up administering is simply custodial care only. The patients may ultimately act as if they're in terms of a self-fulfilling prophecy. I'm in a mental institution, I guess I have to act crazy, and so forth. Increasingly, we see several different reactions to that, and I'm going to skim this simply because we're running out of time here. One of them is essentially community-based mental health centers, based on the recommendation of the U.S. government back in the early 1960s, and that was that we do away with the big mental hospitals. It also was a move that was facilitated by the invention of tranquilizers. The story of the acceptance and implementation of use of tranquilizers is really phenomenal, and it essentially resulted in about an 80 or 85% predicted reduction of number of people needing to be kept in big institutional mental hospitals. And the reason was, if you think about a normal curve, there was some line out on one tail beyond which, if your behavior was more extreme than that, you were hospitalized. You were simply, in the normal distribution, if the cut points, wherever my hand is, here, anything in the tail is, that's bizarre enough, we're going to hospitalize you. The effect of the tranquilizers was essentially to move the acceptable limit of behavior about 2 standard deviations further out. So if you're in the tail of the distribution, that kind of a move is lopping off the largest portion of the tail, and so the net of the distribution. And so the net result is that there was a whopping about a 4 or 5 to 1 reduction in the number of people institutionalized, and that was strictly because of the implementation of tranquilizers. Other kinds of programs that have been implemented are things like patient-conducted halfway houses. The evidence suggests that patients can, in fact, operate in that kind of a situation. And finally, then, we've got various kinds of crisis hotlines that have been created over the years for drugs, for acting out behavior kind of difficulties, and so forth. And the long-term emphasis in these kinds of therapies seems to be essentially toward preventive mental health efforts. And so in that case, what we're going to do is leap directly into the discussion of the relationship between mental health and physical health. And in essence, it was a very nice book written about 20 years ago now by Robert and Jeanette Lauer, Bauer with an L. It was entitled Watersheds, Mastering Life's Unpredictable Crises. And in it, they relate the story of a woman whose husband was a runner who was urging his wife to take up running. And the wife was initially resistant, but ultimately decided to go ahead and do it. I'll shorten a long story. But in essence, the net result was that as she began to, she encountered the expected pain, which had always been used kind of to say, no. But in fact, as she got through that, she began to see certain benefits, like her weight started improving, her general endurance improved, she began to run further, and so forth and so on. And the net result of it was that fairy tale kind of existence actually led to a significant improvement in her life in that way, because she increasingly, systematically put herself into a physically healthy environment and stimulating kind of environment. You begin to wonder, in some sense, given that kind of a story, why are we bothering with mental health in this chapter physical health in this chapter on mental health? And I would refer you right back to the textbook we're using, Whiten's book, in Whiten et al., in which figure 14.1 has a really good summary of exactly why physical health is so relatively important. And if you look at that figure, you can see that things like typhoid fever were eliminated as a significant cause of death back in 1950, as were measles, scarlet fever, whooping cough, and diphtheria. They were all eliminated as threats to human health. Tuberculosis has been essentially eliminated as of about 1990, although there is a certain amount of rebound among former patients that seems to be happening here right now. Pneumonia and influenza have been reduced from thousands of deaths per 100,000 back to where by 1980 it had been reduced to only causing about 20 or 25 deaths per 100,000 people. Things like strokes, for instance, even stroke has generally been in decline as a cause of death over the last century, and just in the last century the number of strokes has been reduced by essentially 50%. And then in effect is that then the question I want to pose to you is, what do all these illnesses share in common? And the answer is essentially that all of them, with one exception, stroke, are basically situations or things that happen to us. They're contagious diseases that are caught either by accident or by incident. And if you look at and plot the three primary causes of death, what you find is that cancer is one, heart disease is a second one, and stroke is a third one. Those are the three major causes of death among humans these days. And the accidents are even lower on this overall scheme, and other causes combined. I've not spelled those out because they tend to be lower proportionally than accidents. We have a lot of different ways in which we can die. But the net effect is that the particular significance of this is that each of these, of the first three, is a chronic illness that can develop over a long period of time. And the one additional illness that has been added to this that we should also mention, of course, is AIDS. And it made a startling arrival on this graph. In 1985, it was already up to on this scale, it was already up to 60 in 1985. By 1990 and 2000, it had quintupled to 320. And at that point, the world was scared enough that corrective measures began to be developed, so that by 2005, on this scale, it was back down to 210 as a cause of death. But the interesting thing is that if you look across all these different illnesses, the psychological aspect of it is that we can name each different condition and we can identify the behaviors that are involved in that kind of a situation. So when you look at heart disease, the relevant behavior is essentially exercise. That is a preventive measure. Cancer, obviously it's smoking and breathing. Most of us are enjoying that particular ability. We seek it. Stroke is primarily caused by our eating behavior, good or bad. And AIDS, of course, is ultimately caused by and interferes with, impacts sexual activity. So in each of these cases where there is a serious condition that impacts our health, there is a way to correct it that is ultimately controllable by you and I in one way or another. It's even been suggested that much of the improvement in mastering the contagious diseases was accompanied by alterations in human behavior, by improved nutrition, and by increased concerns with assessing our health and then maintaining a healthy lifestyle here. Let me suggest to you, for instance, in terms of stroke, I came across a rather interesting source that looked at something that can be described for you by our everyday activities starting at 6, sadly, a.m. as I'm talking about it here. But the greatest time of stroke tends to be in 2 time intervals. One is the morning hours between when you get up and roughly noontime, and, surprisingly enough, the last phase of sleep. Whether is at 3 or maybe even later, 4 or 5 for you, the beginning of this stretch is harder to document. But in essence, what's being pointed out here is that if you look at in fact, let me just read to you here because I wanted to phrase this very carefully. Heart disease, including heart attack, is the world's #1 killer. A person's risk of a heart attack depends mostly on the familiar repertoire of factors that we've already talked about: exercise, smoking, diet, weight, genes. But our body's circadian rhythm actually also plays a role in this situation, which leads to this kind of observation. And that is that the most dangerous times for heart attack, including sudden cardiac death, rupture or aneurysm of the aorta, pulmonary embolism, and stroke, are the morning hours and during the last phase of sleep, that is between 3 and noontime. But we can specify it even more, and that is that a group of, if you'll keep back on the graph, please, a group of Harvard investigators estimated the risk and evaluated that on average, the extra risk of having a myocardial infarction or heart attack between 6 a.m. and noon is about 40%. But if you calculate only the first 3 hours after waking, this relative risk is 3 times greater. So ultimately, the most dangerous period of time for us in terms of heart problems, as indicated on the clock there, is between when you get up and mid-morning for whatever your activity is. I did this simply because I get up at 6 a.m., so I anchored everything around 6. But if you get up at 7, just rotate the clock slightly later. But the overall effect is there in that situation. And so in essence then, let's start looking at a combination of these things that we're looking at here. We're going to take what is called a biopsychosocial view here, and that can be defined essentially simply as a perspective on health, which suggests that biological factors, psychological factors, and or social factors may operate singly or in concert, in cooperation with each other, to impact our health. And the net result is that we can then look at, for instance, biological factors and study things like genes and chromosomes that you studied in high school. Since you did it in high school, I'm not going to go over the elements there, but you may be aware, for instance, of the massive, what was called Human Genome Project, or HGP, that started in 1990 and ran for 13 years, which was a federally organized attempt to basically do 2 things. It was to identify all of the approximately 20 to 25,000 genes in the human DNA, and then secondly, to determine the sequencing of the 3 billion chemical base pairs that make up the human DNA. It was a big-term project, but advances in technology allowed them to make so much progress that it had been intended as a 15-year project. They actually got it done in 13. So by 1993, the work was done. A lot of follow-up work has gone on in studying individual genes and DNA patterns in the overall sequence. But that was a big step toward understanding the fundamental biological process in this case. We can also then, on that same list, already talked about the Human Genome Project, add psychological factors. And in that case, what we're looking at is essentially the point of view that your basic behavior, the thought patterns that you engage in, even your feelings, may play a role in the level of health that you ultimately maintain. Are you incentivized to maintain good health, and so forth? So health psychology essentially becomes a factor that it's the study of how psychological factors can influence the onset, the course, the treatment, and or the cure of disease and illness in our everyday lives, which leads then into one of the factors that impacts that, and that is behavioral genetics. If we look at behavior genetics, what we're looking at is the study of the influence of those genes we were just talking about on our everyday behavior. Empirical work in this area tends to be concentrated on changes in inherited tendencies that would result from selective pressure on us. Basically, behavioral genetics also study the effects of environmental influences on the expression of these tendencies, and that puts it right back into psychology. And the reason is that the interaction that occurs between heredity and environment is remarkably complex. Many have noted, for instance, let me just pose a particular example for you, and that is that many people have noted the potential for the intertwining of genetic impact on our behavior and environmental factors. And what I'm suggesting here is, for instance, just suppose that you had exists a gene for introversion. You are fundamentally genetically inclined to be an introvert. The net result is that, of course, what you inherit is an inclination to work alone. You tend to prefer to be in a quiet place where others are not involved. You feel that you can do the job yourself. Yes or no is a side issue. But in fact, if you are an introvert, the net result is that you tend to expose yourself. The isolated event in which you've placed yourself is likely to influence your development. And so how are we to separate the effects of heredity from the effects of environment in that kind of an example? It really shows that the interaction is key here. What particular heredity puts you or encourages you into a given situation, and how does that environment then feed back onto the kind of behavior that you ultimately generate? It is a very complex process trying to study the various activities that are going on here. But one of the key things that's involved then are the various social factors that we put our particular orientation puts us into. And in general, what we tend to do is to assume that your inheritance determines the extent that a skill that you could develop. The inheritance influences the extent of a skill you can develop, but the environment in which you mature and flourish really determines the amount of that skill, the proportion of that ability that you will actually achieve in a given situation. So let's look specifically at the interaction here between physiological factors and your health. There are a number of different fascinating questions that interrelate both of these in a way that pose questions that we can respond to. One is, if we look at the nervous system, are the brains of maladjusted people demonstrably different from those of the well-adjusted? We could ask that as a question. Do the brains of well-adjusted people operate differently from those of the poorly adjusted? And thirdly, how does our environment influence our brain? There are increasingly precise answers to questions such as these that can be offered. Raising animals in a visually enriched environment with other animals yields brains that are more branched with interneuronal connections. For years, psychologists have recommended the value of having a visually stimulating mobile hanging over a human infant's crib. It just provides a very complex visual environment that will keep the child engaged. If they're otherwise just lying on their back playing with the blanket or something else, that's a specific input that can be very valuable, and the research is quite clear on that. You end up with kids who start playing earlier, who engage in toys, who had moved through the various stages of development earlier, if they've been raised in a crib where this kind of a active mobile is hanging over them. Tragic examples also involve here. And that would involve things like the fact that Charles Whitman climbed the tower at the University of Texas back in 1966 after murdering his wife and his mother, and the net result of that was that 14 additional people were killed as he sniped, and some 24, there's an argument about the actual number, but at least a couple of dozen others were wounded in this situation. Interestingly, an autopsy revealed a massive tumor near the part of the brain that is associated with anger and aggression in Whitman. So at some level, he fundamentally was not responsible for the act in which he engaged there. But it does very clearly show, it demonstrated the direct relationship between the physiological elements of our everyday lives and the relative health, mental, that we enjoy in a given situation. Another element that we can look at, of course, is the endocrine system. We talked about this once before, but let's mention it here again, and that is that if you view the body as a pipe, the exocrine system, involving things like sweat and saliva and so forth, basically secretes into the wall of the pipe. Okay, it goes into the iron of the pipe itself, that is, into our body. But the endocrine glands actually secrete through the wall of the pipe, typically into the digestive tract. Okay, I'm sorry, I misspoke there. Reverse it. The exocrine glands secrete outward through the wall of the pipe onto the outer surface or the inner surface. Thus, saliva is one of the hormones that helps with digestion. It's an internal process. The endocrine glands actually secrete into the wall of the pipe. Okay, and the various hormones that we could talk about are those that are secreting into the circulatory system so that they impact various kinds of development within us. And thus we have things like, well, for instance, the adrenal gland is involved when you face the fight or flight response that may exhibit in that particular case. So the endocrine system is very much involved. Its effect on our behavior tends to be more long-term and indirect. Think, for instance, about the gradualness with which you achieved what are called the secondary sexual characteristics as you move from childlike to adult-like. That's an example of an endocrine system precipitated change, but it occurs over an extended period of time during the adolescent years. Another factor that also is involved here is the immune system. Okay, a defense system that basically is responsible for developing pathogens where potentially harmful agents, it's a defense system, I should say, against pathogens. And what is normally involved there are what are called helper T cells, which enwrap and try to destroy foreign bodies that invade our body. Usually our immune system is to a possible invading foreign agent can be sensitized through immunization, that is through injecting a weakened form of what it is we're trying to encourage the body into developing as a defense. But then, of course, you've got AIDS, acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, which works in a very unusual way, and it was quite surprising when it attacked we humans. And apparently the HIV overpowers the helper T cells and basically converts them into fellow HIV cells that go about attacking the very cells that they are supposed to be protecting. And AIDS victims, interestingly enough, do not die of AIDS. What they tend to do is die of various diseases of opportunity, things which, when hitting the weakened system, find a rich environment and grow to exhibit their particular effects and produce death as the outcome. So then let's look at various kinds of adjustments that we can make for health purposes. One of the things that's very clear is that physical health does affect the mind, and there are a lot of different ways to demonstrate this. There's good evidence to document that being exposed to either of two types of noise leads to permanent damage to your hearing. Okay, one of them is acid rock bands, and I'm not campaigning against acid rock bands, but saying simply that the loudness, which is a tradition in that kind of playing, is the problem in that situation. And if you've noticed, I've attended acid rock bands at various times during my growing up and grown-up life. And it was intriguing to me that when you go listen to an acid rock band, if you notice, the musicians in such a band almost always are wearing earplugs. It's not that they don't enjoy the music that they produce, it's just that the loudness is one of the components of that music, but that above about 125 decibels has long been considered to be dangerous, which is the reason that if you notice workers on the ramp out at Intercontinental when they're working around the jets, always have big earphones on simply to cut down on the ambient noise level. But it turns out OSHA was ultimately able to demonstrate that even if you work in an environment where there's a tone as soft as 75 to 80 decibels, which is not quiet, but essentially even the long-term presence of tones down to as much as 75 or 80 decibels will in fact produce a roll-off at that area. So if you plot a line of sensitivity, how sensitive to a given tone somebody is, they have a loss of sensitivity in the range of 75 to 80 decibels, or sorry, let me say that another way. That given the frequency of the environment in which these workers are operating in the factory that's pictured there, there is a loss of sensitivity on the part of those workers if they are exposed constantly to any particular frequency, whether it be 2,000 or 5,000 or 8,000 cycles, whatever it is. Even as soft as 75 to 80 decibels, over the course of months, weeks, years, they will show a loss of sensitivity to frequencies in that particular range. Zimbardo demonstrated that the elderly, as an example of the consequences of this, tend to become paranoid as they lose their hearing. Because what happens is they hear people who are just casually leaning over and talking to somebody, and the elderly, as they're losing their hearing, become increasingly paranoid. You know, I can't hear that. They must be talking about me. There was a Ziggy cartoon a number of years ago in which he says, how come when people are whispering, the only thing you can hear is your name? And essentially that's kind of the basis for the paranoia that Zimbardo was essentially talking about. But loss of hearing as a physical effect can have impacts on the way in which we process what may or may not be going on around us in a given situation. So your mind, in fact, affects your physical health. It's easiest, perhaps, to demonstrate with stress. If you listen to the lawyers in the opening statements of a big national trial, one news report in the trial of the 4 policemen in L.A., not the 4 policemen, yes, the policeman who beat up Rodney King, one of the early reports on the trial when it was started was noting the fact that the voices of both the offensive and defensive lawyers was tremoring as they started the trial. That is, they were under high pressure in that kind of a situation. That's the environmental physical pressure showing up as higher drive level in that situation. There's a clear tendency for those with cardiovascular problems to have heart attacks, as we noted earlier, in the early morning when your day is starting as the physical stresses are increasing in a given situation. In one study that was conducted in a Veterans Administration, this is an amazing study, but I won't give you the details of it, but essentially what was discovered was that 3 times as many pounds of body parts were removed from patients who had a conversion disorder in the VA hospital, in contrast to those who were otherwise psychologically healthy. Just having a conversion disorder, my body is ill, tripled the amount of body parts that were ultimately removed in operations in that kind of a situation. Mind over matter, quite clearly, in that situation. I once worked in an infirmary at the Tennessee Camp for Diabetic Children, and on Sunday mornings, what happened, the regular sequence of activities for the campers was the fact that they ate breakfast, and then they went swimming. So put in some food and then have them go into high activity. And the next activity was to walk from the swimming pool past the infirmary over to the stadium where a church service was going to be held, a religious service in late morning. And invariably you could stand on that porch of the infirmary and watch as 120 campers walked past. Fully 10% of them would peel off into the infirmary with various kinds of insulin reactions, feeling as though their blood sugar level was too low. It could be argued that that was in fact psychologically caused rather than actually a dropped blood sugar. Clearly it might have been the swimming, but the fact that they were able to get through showering and changing their clothes and everything before all of a sudden, oh my goodness, I'm subject to an insulin reaction, struck them, suggests that there was a psychological component in that situation. Any parent knows that the tender loving care is an effective way to handle a wound, whatever it may be. So then the question is there a link between mind and body? Marcia Angel, back in 1988, a deputy editor of the New England Journal of Medicine, wrote at that time that the use of psychological treatments in treating disease amounts to a rain dance, doing a rain dance. Without wishing to rain on Ms. Angel's parade, let's look at the evidence. Over 30 years ago, George Solomon and Rudolph Moose at Stanford studied women who were genetically predisposed toward rheumatoid arthritis. And what they found was that women experiencing emotional conflict were likely to experience rheumatoid arthritis. Those who were healthy did not experience it. Emotional health was very clearly a preventative factor of the expression of the arthritis. Several lectures ago, we cited another study that bears on the issue. Remember, I was talking about medical students who were studied well before their first term finals, and then just prior to the first term finals. And what was demonstrated was that those who had significantly more white blood cells than the same students at the start. Let me back up and read it to you specifically. Medical students studied a month before med school finals had significantly more white blood cells than the same students at the start of their finals. That's a within subject factor, but the stress of med school led to a deterioration in the disease preventing white blood cells in that situation. The ultimate study for this point was conducted by Cohen, Terrell, and Smith back in 1991, which what they developed was a stress index that was based on 3 different measures. It was applied to over 400 students in the sample that they drew in this particular study. All of them were isolated for 2 days before the study and were otherwise healthy. They were in excellent health at the start of the actual experiment, and they were held for 7 days after the study was initiated. And in essence, in this particular study, the control group was given nasal drops of neutral saline solution. So they did go through the act of putting drops into their nose, but it was simply a saline solution, and they were not otherwise impacted by it. They remained healthy through the study. The experimental groups, on the other hand, were subjected to one of 5 types of cold viruses. That is, what was injected into their nose was a cold virus of one of 5 different types. And the study measured just all manner of different things. It measured even the number of Kleenex that were pulled, that were used each day in a box that was uniquely tied to each individual participant in the study. And the cell counts of the immune system, it ranged from counting Kleenex to counting cells in the particular study. And the results were kind of impressive. That is, what was able to be demonstrated here, what developed was an index of psychological stress. And that was paired off against the percentage of subjects who ended up with colds across those 400 students that were subjects that were studied there. And it's quite clear that there's a linear relationship between the amount of social stress, psychological stress that you're subjected to in a given situation, and the likelihood that a physical illness will overcome you, particularly when they introduced exactly the same quantity of illness at the exact same time across many people who differed widely in stress. But on the base of this study and a number of other studies, we can conclude simply that stress seems to weaken the immune system's functioning. It is a source of the illness that we're subjected to. So then we start looking at, well, okay, what's a healthy life? Well, what we're going to deal with here is what is basically defined as style of life. And we're going to define that essentially as identifying your relatively consistent day-to-day habits of living. Think about your own life here for just a second and pose for yourself the following question. Do you lead any of the following types of lives? Ones that your parents would describe as decadent, drug-free, athletic, where you tend to emphasize physical activity, single as opposed to married, vegetarian? All of those are what I'm talking about by way of styles of life. And in fact, what I'm going to suggest is that I can examine 4 different aspects of our everyday life that will impact the quality of that life that we actually experience. And what it has to do with specifically is nutrition. The example here that I'm talking about is essentially a government nutritionist in the Department of Agriculture a number of years ago introduced he recommended a diet that was composed of carbohydrates, protein, and fat. And what was particularly interesting about this study was the fact that it was originally proposed by Willard O. Atwater, which name you may now immediately forget. But what makes it impressive is that this set of recommendations was actually published in 1894. It's 110 plus years old as a style of living. So the knowledge has been there for a long time. Whether we capitalize on it or not is quite a separate issue. But Willard did offer some rather interesting data, quite stable here, specifically in terms of the fact that his recommendation way back in 1894 was that 52% of our intake should be carbohydrates, stuff that is converted into carbohydrates. 15% of it should be protein, and 33% of it should be fats or fat-related substances. Okay, there have been many versions since, but the latest version actually arrived in 2005. And it was the emphasis even back in the late 1800s was that we have a balanced diet and that these were the recommended figures by way of the balancing that we should do. But the government ultimately formalized those recommendations in the form of what was called a food pyramid, introduced back in about 1990, 1992, somewhere back in there. But it was converted ultimately about 10 years later, actually 2005, it was converted into what is referred to as a food pyramid. And this is the general attractive feature that they organize or use to market this particular set of advices, if we can call it that, plans, activities, recommended activities. Consumption is essentially what we're dealing with here. And the net result was that out of that pyramid were identified 4 different primary food groups, and we'll talk about each of those here in a minute. I'll get back to this in a minute, but to show you where it all comes from. In terms of the My Pyramid, using the symbol that is now popular or popularized by the government, adopted by the government, there are 4 fundamental food groups that we can talk about. One involves dairy products, one involves fruits and vegetables, one involves grains, and one involves meats in various forms. And in fact, among those 4 primary food groups, the government ultimately developed 5 general recommendations which were published along with the revised attention-getting device in 2005. And I think it's instructive to spend some time looking at that. So this, I'm going to stick on this curve for a while. It has words that are small enough that I'm going to have to identify them with you. I tried, and there was no easy way to get all the information onto the screen that I really need here. But let me just spend a little bit of time talking about this, and if we have the time, we'll come back to it a little bit later. The net result is that what you can see here is that probably the single most important recommendation is covered up over in this corner, and you can access this on a computer anywhere. Just go in and dial up, under the U.S. government, dial up My Pyramid, or don't even do that, just dial up, as I did, My Pyramid to find it. And it's right there. There are all sorts of sources built around this. But the primary recommendation that was changed between 1990 and 2005 was the fact that in terms of fats, oils, and sweets, it is recommended that simply that you use them sparingly. They have cut down on that 33 or 35% recommendation substantially in the intervening time. And that is simply that fats, oils, and sweeteners sweets are simply recommended for use sparingly. That's for you to judge. But the breakdown otherwise is essentially as follows, and that is that in terms of milk products, which are here in the diagram, this includes milk, yogurt, and cheesy group as defined there. The modern recommendation is that you get 2 or 3 of those per day in terms of what's going on in your intake. In essence, it is recommended that children up to the teenage years use full 4% milk, that is the regular homogenized milk as the input, with a recommendation of perhaps twice as much milk as you'll ultimately drink as an adolescent. The key shift that occurs as you move from adolescence from childhood into adolescence is that from adolescence onward, the milk recommendation in terms of units that you take in, glasses of milk, is cut in half, essentially. And the percentage that is utilized drops slightly. I know I have an example of this. I'll get to this a little bit later, but the point is that you shift from a childlike adult recommendation to an adult adolescent/adult dosage, which is about half as large as what's recommended for children, and it's accompanied by a shift toward non-fat milk in the situation. If we look then at meats, poultry, fish, dry beans, eggs, and nuts group, we're also at the same level. About 2 to 3 servings per day is what's now recommended. And that's including lean meat, poultry, fish, legumes, which includes, I love this, podded plants. Not potted, podded. And that means things like peas and beans, which come in pods. That's what's really being recommended there. I love that word when I found it. So we're concerned with podded plants. Another general group is the fruit group, where you have essentially the same level, even perhaps slightly higher, of 2 to 3 helpings in the fruit group. And there, what we're talking about is servings of a half cup of raw or cooked vegetables or fruits in a given situation. It is intriguing that they don't stress, as much as I expected they would in this, the difference between cooked and uncooked. Because it turns out, and this is a broad oversimplification, but the bottom line is correct, and that is that if you take a set of peas that you could eat raw, you will actually destroy about half of the nutrient value just in putting the peas in water and boiling them. That is, if you bring them up to edible temperature and then pour off the water, you've thrown away about half of the total nutrient values of a serving of peas. Your grandmother's old trick of saving the water in which you cook vegetables for making stew out of is a really astute common sense observation to make. It's something where the granny school is in fact correct. The idea of saving the water in which you cook or prepare fruits or vegetables, for that matter, vegetables or fruits, is a wise one. You're saving a significant amount of calories in doing that kind of thing. So again, all fruits and vegetables, including citrus fruits and dark green or yellow vegetables, those are the kind of things that should be used in that situation. And then we have the bread group, essentially bread, cereal, rice, and pasta group. And there you get to go bananas. You get to, well, that's the wrong word to use. You get to go breads in this case. But in essence, here you should be consuming up to 6 to almost a dozen, where in this case, one slice of fortified or whole grain bread is considered to be a serving. I was amazed as a diabetic. My parents had control over my life back when I was 10, I think, when I developed it. And one of the most valuable things my mother did, I hated at the time, but she weighed everything I ate from the time I got it in I think it was 6th grade, if I remember correctly, until I graduated high school, because of course I was living at home. And she took the time and the trouble to weigh everything. She was a little bit of an OCD, but as I challenged her on it way later, she did point out that one of the benefits that came out of that for me was a very practiced eye on being able to go down through a cafeteria and figure out what a regular serving actually is. I read, I don't know whether I mentioned this earlier, but our orientation toward food has really changed substantially in the last, over the course of humanity itself. And one of the things that was pointed out is that if you look at the size of the food helpings in the Last Supper, in the painting of the Last Supper, it has essentially doubled in the last 1,000 years. It's maybe not even that great. It's if I remember the reference, it was something like 78% average increase. And of course, that's a rough figure because you're looking at relative sizes and trying to judge proportions and everything else. But it is clear that the depictions of the Last Supper that are more modern feature larger amounts of food. It's very clear that we've been moving in that direction. On top of which, of course, we've piled the increased quality of what it is we're producing. We have very good foodstuffs these days available to us. And so the recommendation in terms of bread and cereal is as indicated in the diagram there. That is that it's up to 6 to 11 servings is what's being recommended. Whether it's one corn tortilla or a half to 3/4 of a cup of cooked, fortified, or whole grain cereal, rice, grits, macaroni. There are a lot of different ways in which you can satisfy that. The main advice in governmentally funded, supported diet plans is essentially cut down on fat. And when you start dieting, it's not as easy as it might seem for a variety of reasons related, among other things, to the fact that cereal makers are in the business of selling you cereal. And so they pile on features like, added vitamin C, added this, bonus that, and so forth. The net result is you may have an overly intense product that you buy. When you talk about light brands, sometimes they will have as many grams of fat as the regular version does. It is worthwhile to spend a little time reading the labels of your favorite products, whatever they happen to be, because you may be surprised at some of the things you find. To give you a very specific example, regular milk draws 50% of its 50% of its calories from fat. But it isn't that simple. It isn't the fact that if you go from homogenized, regular, full 4% milk, you drop down to 2% fat milk, which they will trumpet on the carton. But look at what actually happens there. 2% fat milk is drawing 45% of its calories from fat. So by cutting the percentage from 4 to 2, you thinking to yourself, well, I cut my fat consumption in half. No, you cut it by about 10%. Is all. And in fact, skim milk is the only one that provides 0% of its calories from fat. You really have to drop all the way to skim milk. You'll notice when I was going through the age requirements for milk, the jump is from 4% homogenized, to totally fat-free milk. You don't. The 2% really serves no purpose because it doesn't cut your fat consumption noticeably in that kind of a situation. Cholesterol-free mayonnaise still contains 11 grams of fat per tablespoon, just like regular mayonnaise does. Light cooking involves 14 grams of fat per tablespoon. Regular cooking oil involves 14 grams of fat per tablespoon. So you really have to read the label itself to figure out what you're actually doing to yourself calorically. And the net result, if you fail to do so, is that you end up in a condition called obesity, which we're going to define as simply it exists when your body is greater than 20% of the total weight, the ideal weight in men. Is greater than 20% over your total weight in ideal weight in men, and 30% of the total weight in women. If you're outside those bounds, you're considered to be obese, okay? That kind of obesity is thought to place us at risk for things like heart disease, diabetes, cancer, among others. Diabetes is certainly a condition that is rampant right now in society. We are creating way too many diabetics. And I can remember when I used to go to Tennessee Camp for Diabetic Children years ago, we were being told at the time that you can't eat your way into diabetes. It's strictly genetic. Well, that doesn't turn out to be true. It turns out that the richness of our diet has put us into a dangerous situation as a society, where in fact we are eating our way through overly rich foods into what we're now experiencing, which is a whopping increase in the number of people subjected to experiencing diabetes in a given situation. Relative to dieting, there was an interesting study that I found. It was done by Wadden, Foster, Letitia, and Stunkard in 1992, in which what they did was to compare dieters that were using a low-calorie liquid diet as one format with those who were using regular food and behavioral counseling. And what they found was that there was no significant difference in the weight loss that was experienced. So these diet fads with fancy labels may not necessarily affect your weight loss in any significant way, certainly differentially from any other plan that's going. Even if weight is taken off, many do not follow through with the completion of that initial loss and the maintenance of the new or lower weight that happens. That's sometimes referred to jokingly as the Oprah Winfrey diet, where you at some point slightly overweight, making a public announcement that you're going to go on a diet, and you get all sorts of social support for doing so, and the pounds fall off, you lose weight. And then when you turn around, all of a sudden, whoops, the weight is gradually creeping back up again, and you get a kind of a sine wave effect called the Oprah Winfrey diet, where you're overweight, you diet down, you grow back to overweight, and so forth and so on. Any diet will work if you stick to it, and that's the key, okay? And also the fact that genetics are not stacked against you. There are some of us whose genetics simply argue that this is the particular kind of weight, or move us toward a particular kind of weight. But to diet, it's fairly simple, actually. What I would do is start with a medical doctor's consultation. Go get a physical exam before you start seriously trying to lose weight, and talk to a diet about your particular plan that you have in mind. What that should involve, that talk and exam should involve, is any medical cautions that are necessary regarding obstacles. I'm thinking here of something like diabetes, because yeah, I'd like to lose weight, but if I'm going to do so, I have to very carefully balance the diet and ratchet down all three elements: carbohydrates, protein, and fat. I can't just simply give up on fats. That's not the way to do it. And any other restrictions that might be advised for your particular body chemistry. But with that in mind, What you would also want to do is examine any similar limits with respect to the program of exercise that is going to accompany the dieting that you do. You really achieve the loss of weight by two things, dieting and exercise. We'll get to the exercising here a little bit later. So then what you have to do, there are several very systematic, easy things that you can do in a dieting situation. Number one, and not obvious, eat slowly. Most of us have got 11 minutes for lunch. We have to ingest the sandwich, the carton of milk, or whatever we brought, the fruit, and then be out and doing whatever we're supposed to do. Slow down. Second way to do that, and it's a matter of structuring your environment basically, but cut your food into small bits. Take the time to take any piece of meat and cut it into smaller bites. The very act of cutting is going to slow you down. First of all, it is activity, exercise. But in addition, it's accompanied by two other pieces of advice, and that is put the food into your mouth one at a time and chew it thoroughly and swallow it before you put the next bite in. You and I are very efficient. Okay, we can shovel that food into the front of the mouth and we chew it up, use the incisors to cut up a very small piece, and then we move it to the back to grind it. And we've got the next load in the front already starting. So we've got this real efficient mouth factory going that takes in the calories, serves it up perfectly for the tummy, and dumps it right in there very efficiently. Foul that up to lose weight. And I mean that literally in the sense that what you need to do is basically mechanically cut the food into smaller pieces and force yourself, really concentrate. Eventually you won't have to, but initially concentrate on, okay, I've swallowed the food. Now you've got permission to take the next bite, but don't do it until you've chewed it thoroughly and swallowed it. And then the second one, and you can see obviously what that's going to do is stretch out the amount of time that you take. It slows you down in terms of ingesting calories. What that capitalizes on is a learn factor, and that is I gave you the example earlier, 11 minutes for lunch. I mean, it was a little bit trite, but in fact, most of us have a set amount of time that we dedicate to a given meal. And if you've put in some rituals that involve, for instance, cutting it up into smaller slices and change the eating pattern so you're doing it one at a time, what it does is to cut down on the rate at which you're ingesting calories. You've occupied the time, and you can then cut yourself off at a lower level. You kind of trick yourself into feeling, well, I spent 11 minutes with lunch, so that should be good. Well, if the effect is that you've eaten less, the net effect is ultimately very positive in that kind of a situation. A couple of other things you should factor into your eating plan. One is to eat at regular times. It may seem a little goofy, but if you do lunch at noon, do it every day at noon, even Saturday and Sunday. Eat at regular intervals. If you eat supper at 6:30, do it every day at 6:30 so that your body gets built around, your habits get built around a particular sequence of particular meals at particular times of the day. Diet slowly. Do not plan to take it all off in the first week. Ronald Cohen, in 1994, suggested a really nice model that targets three different sources of the causes for being overweight. And what that model looks like is this. And that is what we're going to look at is what are the sources of excess weight. And they turn out, first of all, biologically to be genetic problems, metabolic problems, bone structure problems. Any of those can cause difficulties with maintaining or having excess weight. Psychologically, it may have to do with your self-image, the self-esteem that you feel about yourself. You may turn to eating as an emotional release for the pressures you subject yourself to. Even fatigue may in some cases cause you to eat too much. Worse than that, it may cause you to eat late. You come home from work exhausted, and you sit down and read the paper or watch TV or whatever, and then at 10 o'clock at night you realize, oh gee, I really better put some supper in. So you put supper in and then go to bed. And the net result is you've dumped in a whole load of food right on top of a stomach that's then going to go to sleep. That's not a good way that's guaranteeing essentially you're going to grow fatter with the food you put in. Social factors include the idea that lonely people, competitive people, tend to experience weight problems in various kinds of ways. And in fact, the loneliness is probably the key factor there. But even cultural ideals. We have certain cultures that actually value overweight people, and some people eat to establish that kind of a norm. Fat person is always jolly, kind of figuring if you get fat, you get jolly. Consequences. and I'm going to come back and talk about this, but the growth in the number of fat cells is a consequence of putting on if you eat too much. The net result is that food gets converted into fat cells. It generates psychologically a negative self-image, and socially it can lead into teasing and even ostracism. Ostracism is more likely an adult problem, but the teasing is clearly present in elementary, middle, and high school. And then finally, we have various kinds of treatments that can be proposed, where you may go for medication or correction by surgery. Therapeutic techniques, I won't go through all this, you can read as well as I can. And so then you have to get it off. How do you get it off? If you get it off, what do? Well, it leads to a very interesting problem. And it takes a minute to describe what the nature of the problem is, but if I don't if I don't finish anything else here today, this is something I want to do, and that is, if you gain weight, you add fat cells. There is no way around that. If your body doesn't have enough fat cells to store the energy you eat, it will create new ones. It's an easy process. You're not even aware of it, but it's going on. If you lose weight, you do not lose fat cells. What happens is that every fat cell in the body, if you've eaten up to where you're 15 pounds overweight, you have an extra 15 pounds of fat storage facilities built into your body. If you start dieting to lose weight, what happens is last in, first out doesn't exist with fat cells. Once they're created, they're there. And it's going to take several years to get rid of them. And the burden that you're saddled with is the fact that if you start dieting and your weight starts dropping, every single one of those fat cells gives up a little bit and therefore starts grumbling at you. It makes you feel hungry. And instead of having a set number, since you're overweight, you have a larger number of fat cells, all of which are demanding food. Keeping it off can also be a real big problem. So if you're able to overcome the dropping it off, there was a really fascinating report that I would recommend you go read in the March 1995 issue of the New England Journal of Medicine on a 10-year study of dieters. And what they found was that relative to your optimum weight, not precisely defined, but whatever is genetically and spiritually in your head as the optimal weight, your system is of average intensity when you are at the weight that you should be at, your target weight. If your system is below average, your efficiency increases, okay? If your system is above average efficiency, sorry, I misspoke there. The point is that if you diet, your weight drops. The problem is, the hooker is, your efficiency in processing food goes up. And the net result is that has at least two implications regarding the output of dieting. And that is that if you lose weight to a specific level below what your body judges to be ideal, the body itself increases its efficiency. It pulls more calories out of the food that you're eating. And as a result of the lower calorie diet, you get the Oprah Winfrey effect. You lose the weight, but then if you don't change the diet, you gain it right back, because the body is being more efficient in pulling the calories that you're allowing it out of the food that you're giving to it. And so basically, in order to lose the weight, what you have to do is to cut the calories again. You cut it one time to take it off, you cut it a second time to keep it off. And that's the fact that most plans simply do not take into account. Most diet plans don't work because they don't address the increasing efficiency issue. Yeah, they can get you to take it off. You're starving yourself. But in fact, what you have to do is cut the calorie at the new level. When you get that weight off to a level you're happy with, cut the calorie intake again in order to keep it off, to counter the growing efficiency. And it's a very subtle mechanism we're dealing with here. Let me just burden you with a couple of numbers here. In 20 years, the average male, and I don't want you to remember this other than the bottom line, but the average male will consume 200 million calories in the average of 20 years. To gain 10 pounds over those 20 years, what you need to do is consume 60,000 calories. So you divide those 60,000 by 20 years, that's 3,000 calories per year added to your diet. You divide by 365, the number of days in the year, and that means you have to add 8.22 calories to your diet to be 10 pounds heavier in 2 decades. It is a remarkably subtly determined ability to master a particular calorie level. Let me back up and say it again. your weight is defined very precisely. And even adding a pat a day of butter a day will add essentially 10 pounds in a year. I mean, that's another way to say it. But if you knock off 100 calories a day, you can lose a pound a month. If you knock off 430 calories a day, you can lose a pound a week. So the effect is very direct. Eat less food, weigh less. Another way to handle it is in terms of exercise. Sorry, cut the calories, cut them again. And then persevere. That's what we don't tend to remember. And in turn, then exercise is the word I was expecting there. And that's the other way to do it. Warm up first. No pain, no gain is simply not correct. Okay? You may be injuring yourself or overstressing yourself if you feel pain. Your body is telling you something there. Especially in strenuous sports, build up to a rewarding level of exercise. Biking is a good example because that involves a lot of different muscles. But don't try to bike all the way to school if you live in Katy on day one. Take your bike, ride Metro in part way and ride the rest of the way, and then increase the length of the exercise gradually. And like learning, don't engage in mass practice. Mass practice is not an effective way to lose all the weight at once. It is better to do it with distributed practice. Take a little bit off, set a goal, and knock it off gradually as you're going through it. And to show you what's involved here, I just took a sample of some of the amounts of calories that are burned depending on various kinds of activity that you engage in. And in fact, relative to sleeping, the number of calories burned is 14. Now that might make you think, okay, I'll just sleep 24 hours a day and knock off 14 calories a day. An hour. That's a hourly rate that's going on there. The problem is that if you do it 24 hours a day, you only knock off 336 calories, and you end up wasting an extraordinary amount of time. So I would not recommend that. But as you can look at the list there, you can see that if you sit and write, you've added 50% to the amount of calories that you're dropping in a given situation. And as you run down the list, something like running is much more consuming of resources. I personally don't think that racquetball is only 104, but I'm willing to concede maybe we should negotiate with runners on that one. But in fact, biking at 13 miles an hour, which is when you're really beginning to push it. I mean, that's noticeable in your body. You're doing it at 178 calories an hour. So that is an effective way to take off the various calories. But I don't think sleep is the way to do it in this situation. And sleeping. And finally, then, let's look at sleep as another thing to really control in terms of creating a healthy life for yourself. The single most sleep-deprived population in the world is college students in the United States of America. Okay? What you do is work yourself too late and then fall in bed exhausted or drug yourself to sleep. And then the next morning you're hammered awake by an alarm clock and you go forth grimly and grudgingly into your day, sometimes even with a wake-up pill. So you hammer yourself to sleep and then you have to hammer yourself awake in that kind of a situation. First things to do in terms of getting control of your sleep behavior is, if you find that you're sleeping during the day, your body is trying to tell you something. Go to sleep. Take time off. Don't sleep at your desk. The desk is not designed for sleep. It's darned uncomfortable. It's hard. You haven't got any place for your elbows and particularly for your head. So go to the place where sleep is appropriate, at least a couch, preferably your bed. Another general solution to that is it's really just remarkably direct. Get up a little later or go to bed a little bit earlier. Don't work quite as hard if you're sleepy. Spend more time sleeping. It's a very simple formula. Another thing I would suggest, and this maybe has to be a summertime activity, but remove your alarm clock and see what your schedule actually looks like. That is, when do you normally wake up if you don't have an alarm clock? If you're habit-driven, you may find that you always wake up anyway at 6 or 7 or 7:30 or whenever. But essentially get rid of it and see what your body does when you don't put so many pressures on it. What time do you wake up? And Christmas vacation should be long enough to be able to settle down your system enough so that you can actually determine what is the time at which you normally get up. And keep the time of going to bed at a stable time so that when you're determining by when you wake up how much time you need, you have to start at a given time. Having difficulties with it? Well, follow a regular schedule. That's one thing to do. Regularize what you're doing in terms of going to sleep time and waking up time once you establish what that is. Secondly, seems dumb, it's very direct. Avoid caffeine. Avoid stimulating stuff. Okay? Because it's going to be, you're thinking, well, I'll drink it at 7 and I'll be okay. If you go to bed at 10, that thing is just past peak and it's going to be with you a long time. Avoid emotional stuff after supper. If you're going to have an argument, do it during the morning or the early afternoon so that the hormones have had time to settle down by the end. Okay? Use your bed and preferably your bedroom only for sleeping. That's the training then. That, okay, I'm in this room, I'm here to go to sleep. It increases the likelihood that you can get to sleep if that's the only thing you do in the bedroom. Maintain a place where sleep is likely. It should be quiet, it should be dark, and it should be comfortable for you. And these habits overall of lifestyle, of nutrition and dieting, as we've been talking about it today, of exercise, and even of sleep, should ultimately lead you to a healthier you.